South Korea's economy has been one of the biggest economic miracles to ever happen to the world in the past few decades. It rose from a war-torn, impoverished nation to a global powerhouse. It is what has built South Korea today, a technologically advanced nation with some of the world's biggest corporations that produces blockbuster products. One of the most often cited reasons for South Korea's economic miracle is no other than its government. People often think that South Korea's government handles a large portion of the country's economy and is a key economic driver of it. But that's actually quite the opposite of where South Korea is. Its government isn't as interventionist in its economy as one might assume for such a rapid economic rise. Here's a graph to show you the expenditure as a percentage of GDP of South Korea. What this data can tell us is how much of a country's government spends relative to the size of its economy. As you can see from the graph, with data that we collected from the International Monetary Fund, the expenditure of South Korea for the latest year of 2024 sits at 22.64%. And as you can see from the graph, it has been rising every single year. Back in 1995, when data availability came out, the expenditure was just 13.49%. This is where we show how South Korea's government is one of the most unique spenders out there. And the only time we can show that is if we add similar nations to this graph. Let's add Japan, Germany, the US, and the average of advanced economies. As you can see, South Korea's expenditure as a percentage of GDP is much less than any of these countries, and even compared to the average of advanced economies. If we add the low-income developing countries to the graph, we even get to see this. South Korea's expenditure is nearly as low as low-income developing countries. What this basically means is that South Korea's government plays a relatively smaller role in its economy compared to other advanced nations, and even aligns more closely with low-income developing countries in terms of government spending. It could mean that the Korean government is not giving out public welfare programs or social safety nets as much as those in other developed economies. You might then wonder why. Why is this the case? Is it because South Korea's government is neglecting its responsibilities? Or is there a more deliberate strategy behind this unique approach? Well, to understand this, it is first important to understand the history that underpins the economic structure of South Korea. Before we continue, a big thanks to Surfshark VPN for sponsoring this video. Surfshark VPN is your tool for protecting your online privacy and unlocking the internet's potential. Whether streaming global content, bypassing geo-restrictions, or securing your connection on public Wi-Fi, Surfshark has you covered. With 3,000 servers in 100 countries, a strict no-logs policy, and unlimited device connections, Surfshark combines convenience with top-notch security. Its clean web feature blocks ads, malware, and phishing attempts, ensuring a smoother browsing experience. If you're in Korea, imagine catching up on your favorite international shows or using apps that might be restricted. Surfshark makes it effortless. Heading abroad? Stay connected to Korean streaming platforms and news as if you never left home. It's not just a tool, it's peace of mind, knowing you're in control of your digital experience wherever you are. Visit surfshark.com/BehindAsia. That's surfshark.com/BehindAsia to grab an exclusive deal with 4 extra months free. Whether exploring global content or staying linked to Korea while traveling, Surfshark is the perfect companion. Now, let's dive back into South Korea's government spending strategies and economic growth. The Korean economic miracle was built on a foundation of rapid industrialization and export-driven growth starting in the 1960s. During this period, the government focused its resources on fostering economic growth by supporting private sector development rather than establishing extensive welfare programs. They were basically spending a lot on building roads, ports, and industrial complexes to support manufacturing and exports. but little on social programs like pensions or unemployment benefits. Here's a graph on the public social spending as a share of GDP, data that we collected from the OECD. As you can see, South Korea's social spending, which includes things like health, old age, unemployment, housing, and so on, has been on the rise. But the data can already tell us just how low it is when we compare it to other major economies. Let's add the US and Germany to this graph. As you can see, public social spending as a share of GDP is much lower in South Korea than that of Germany and the US from 1990 to 2016. Even if we add most European countries to this list, it would be the same. This is a reflection of how South Korea was built. Their rapid industrialization, which prioritized the economy over well-being in the 1960s, continued to this very day. Additionally, government health expenditure as a share of GDP, which includes spending on things like government-funded healthcare systems and social health insurance, as well as compulsory health insurance, is also low in South Korea. Here's a graph with data collected from the same source, OECD, showing the historical government health expenditure as a share of GDP of South Korea. As you can see, healthcare spending is on the rise. But if we add Japan, Germany, the US to this graph, we get to see that South Korea's spending has always been low compared to major developed economies. It was true back when it was still developing, and it is still true even though it is a developed economy today. These two indicators then highlight just how low social and healthcare spending is in South Korea. This is a significant contributor as to why government spending is low in South Korea compared to nearly all developed economies. But some of you might think that this is bad, right? Is the Korean government really neglecting its citizens? Well, as we mentioned earlier, while they are spending less on these things, they are spending a lot on building their economy. Here's another graph from the same source, OECD, on the general government spending economic affairs as a percentage of GDP in 1975. You can see that back then, the Korean government was spending so much more on their economic affairs, even as compared to the US. The spending as a percentage of GDP was over 7.07%, which was so much more than the United States at just 4.29%. It is good to remember that one of the previous graphs we showed was that the healthcare spending of South Korea to GDP was very low compared to the US at just 0.24%, whereas the US had over 2.99%. Here's a graph on the latest year available in OECD for 2021 on the economic affairs spending. As you can see, South Korea is still heavily invested in their economic affairs spending and is only second to Germany, but is ahead of the UK, Japan, and the US. This basically answers the question as to why South Korea's government spending is low, as historically the country prioritized economic affairs over things like social programs. However, while that is true, it is also important to know that South Korea's economy is mostly driven by its chaebols, also known as large family-owned conglomerates. These companies are then the ones tasked with providing jobs to Koreans and social stability, which reduces the need for a large government safety net. Finally, it is also important to know that while the history of South Korea's rise and chaebol plays a role in limited government spending, they are not the only ones out there. Culture also plays a role, along with fiscal prudence, and even the fact that South Korea just grew too fast, leaving little time for them to actually build comprehensive social safety nets. Hence, why in recent years their social spending has actually increased, as the country is now trying to take care of its people, especially its aging population, which may require a lot of government spending to take care of. Now, there's of course positives and negatives that go into low government spending. There are a number of studies out there that support the cause for bigger governments, whereas others support smaller governments. Who's right or wrong, however, is quite difficult to say. After all, if both can enable one's economies to flourish, then nobody might be wrong after all. Here's a graph with data that we collected from Our World in Data on government spending as a share of GDP versus GDP per capita in 2022. This basically shows the relationship between how much governments spend relative to their economies and the level of wealth per person, measured as GDP per capita. As you can see, a number of economies out there that have high government spending have high GDP per capitas. You can see that countries like Germany, France, and Japan have high expenditures and at the same time have high per capitas. But then you have South Korea, which actually has a higher GDP per capita as measured in international dollars in 2011 prices than Japan, yet lower government expenditures as a percentage of GDP. The same is true when South Korea is compared to other European economies. There are only a few other economies out there like Ireland, the UAE and Qatar who have lower government spending, yet have high GDP per capitas. But of course, it is easy to see just why the UAE and Qatar are rich, since they are swimming in oil money. Ireland, on the other hand, has become a global hub for multinational corporations, particularly in the tech and pharmaceutical sectors, thanks to its low corporate tax rates and business-friendly environment. This has significantly boosted its GDP per capita. South Korea, however, as you can already tell, has its own reasons. The economy is driven by a strong private sector, with companies like Hyundai and Samsung boosting economic growth. So, what are the downsides to lower government spending? Well, one of the ways economists say about high government spending is that it is a tool, an important tool to reduce inequality. Fortunately, despite having lower government spending, South Korea actually stands out in terms of inequality. Here's a graph on the Gini coefficient in 2022, which is an indicator that measures income inequality within a country. A lower Gini coefficient indicates a more equal distribution of income, while a higher Gini coefficient suggests greater inequality. As you can see, despite South Korea's lower government spending, its inequality, according to the World Inequality Database, is doing better than Japan, Germany, and the US, countries that have higher government spending. Put simply, several studies out there say that low government spending is a cause for inequality, which is a big downside, but due to several reasons, South Korea is an outlier. Now, let's move on to the upside of having lower government spending. But before we go there, it is important to know that the reduction of inequality is not the only downside. There's a lot out there. Things like limited social safety nets, poor support for its aging population, regional disparities, and so on. There are a lot of reasons why low government spending is good, but the biggest one that we know that will resonate with most people is low debt. Here's a graph on the gross debt position as a percentage of GDP of South Korea compared to other developed economies. You can clearly see just how low South Korea's debt is, and one of the reasons behind this is nothing but low government spending. With less spending, it just means they have less reason to borrow. Now, before we end the video, it is important to note that while South Korea's government spending is low, it doesn't necessarily mean it is good or bad. There's a lot of things that can go into it, and what we've discussed today is just a small slice of it. Furthermore, as South Korea's population ages, it is likely that their spending will rise. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.